A normal day in the Middle Ages did not begin with comfort or calm. It began with cold. Cold that had settled into the bones during the night and never fully left. Cold that made movement slow and painful. Cold that reminded people they were alive and vulnerable. Before sunrise, people were already awake, not because they wanted to be productive, but because daylight was the most valuable resource they had. There was no electricity, no artificial light to stretch the day, no warmth that could be summoned with a switch. When the sun rose, life moved. When it set, life stopped. Most people slept in a single room. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes livestock. Animals were kept close for warmth and protection, their breathing mixed with human breath in the dark. Privacy did not exist. The air was thick with smoke from the hearth. It clung to clothes, hair, skin. It never truly disappeared. Walls were rough and damp. Floors were earth or uneven wood. Beds were not places of rest. They were places of recovery. Straw mattresses collapsed quickly and attracted insects. Blankets were thin and often shared. Sleep was shallow. People woke repeatedly through the night, from hunger, from cold, from coughing. Children cried. Adults listened. Every sound in the darkness mattered. Morning did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly through cracks and small windows. There were no clocks. The body learned time by instinct, by light, by routine. As soon as there was enough light to see, work began. Fire had to be rebuilt from embers, ashes removed, water carried. Water was never easy. Buckets were heavy. Wells were far. Streams were unreliable. In winter, water froze. In summer, it dried. Every basic action required effort. Food was uncertain. Breakfast was not a ritual. It was an opportunity. If there was bread, it was eaten. If there was porridge, it was shared. Often, there was nothing. Hunger was familiar. Children did not stay idle. The moment a child could walk steadily, they were expected to help. There was no clear beginning of responsibility. It simply arrived. Boys followed adults into fields or workshops. Girls were taught household labor early. Mistakes were corrected quickly, often harshly. Efficiency mattered more than comfort. Morning labor was relentless. Fields were worked by hand. Plows were heavy. Soil was unforgiving. The same movements were repeated for hours. Bending, lifting, pulling. Hands cracked and bled. Muscles burned constantly. Pain was not discussed. Pain was assumed. Stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant hunger later. As the sun climbed higher, exhaustion grew. Sweat soaked clothing that would not be changed for days. Dirt pressed into skin. Bathing was rare. Smell was normal. Cities intensified everything. Narrow streets trapped waste. Animals roamed freely. Trash was thrown outside. Disease thrived. People did not understand why illness spread. They accepted it as fate or punishment. Midday offered a brief pause. If food existed, bread formed the base of nearly every meal, hard, dense, often stale. Soup or porridge stretched ingredients thin. Meals were quick. There was no extended rest. Time was measured by the sun's position, not minutes. Work resumed immediately. Afternoon was the most dangerous part of the day. The body was tired. The mind slowed. This was when injuries happened. A tool slipped. A foot missed its step. Cuts and breaks were common. Any wound could become fatal. Infection arrived quickly. There was no real medicine. Pain was endured silently. As the sun lowered, work slowed out of necessity, not because tasks were finished, but because light was fading. Evening was preparation. Animals were secured. Tools stored. Food protected from pests. Dinner was small, often the same food as earlier, sometimes less. Families gathered around the fire. This was the closest thing to rest. Stories were told. News traveled by word. Deaths were discussed plainly. Fear was always present, but rarely spoken loudly. Religion shaped the evening. Prayers were routine. Faith was protection when nothing else existed. Darkness arrived fully. Night was feared. Fire could spread unnoticed. Thieves moved quietly. Animals prowled. City gates closed. Doors were barred. Candles were expensive. Light was rationed. People went to sleep early. Not because they were rested, but because darkness offered no alternative. Sleep was uneasy. Nightmares were common. Coughs echoed in the room. Every sound felt significant. Morning always came too soon, and the cycle repeated. Day after day, season after season, year after year. No weekends, no vacations. Life was labor. It was about endurance. Surviving one more day was success, and tomorrow, the same life would begin again. But life was not the same for everyone. A day in a village was different from a day in a town. A nobleman's child experienced the sun differently than a peasant's. Yet, even the wealthy were not free from labor and fear. For peasants, the fields were everything. The soil demanded constant attention. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Each season had its own urgency. Spring brought planting. Every hand was needed. Children carried seeds. Women helped with tools and tending small gardens. Men worked the heavy plows, often until their backs screamed. Summer meant constant vigilance. Crops had to be protected from pests and weather. Irrigation, weeding, and checking fences consumed the hours. Evenings were filled with mending tools, repairing houses, or preparing for market trips. Autumn was harvest season, the most exhausting part of the year. Fields were stripped bare. Grains were carried to barns. Every moment of daylight was precious. The body ached. Hands were blistered. Feet were sore. Children who could barely lift a sack carried what they could. Fatigue settled deep in bones and muscles. Winter was cruel. Cold seeped into bones. Work continued, but it was shorter and more desperate. Fires burned constantly, consuming precious wood. Food stores were checked and rationed. Families worried about surviving until spring. In towns, life was slightly different, but no less grueling. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers had their own relentless schedule. Apprentices learned trades from a young age. Boys swept floors, carried heavy materials, mixed ingredients, or helped craft tools. Girls were taught weaving, sewing, cooking, and household maintenance. Every mistake brought punishment or scolding. Every day demanded productivity. Merchants rose before sunrise. They opened stalls, measured goods, negotiated sales, cleaned streets, and prepared wares for the next market day. Middle-class townsfolk lived closely. Streets were narrow. Crowds pressed constantly. The smell of filth was unavoidable. Life was gritty, unrelenting, and ever-present. Even the nobility was not immune to hardship. Lords and ladies did not toil in the fields, but they spent hours supervising work, managing estates, and ensuring enough food and resources for all under their care. They feared raids, political disputes, and disease. They feared rebellion from those they depended upon. From childhood to old age, bodies changed quickly. Children grew fast from labor and lack of consistent nutrition. By the age of 10, a peasant child was almost indistinguishable in strength from an adult. By 15, the body was hardened, conditioned by daily toil. Adults faced constant wear and tear. Backs were bent, hands were calloused, joints ached. The smallest wound could fester. Teeth were often rotten. Eyes strained from smoke and low light. Old age was rare. If a person survived into their 40s or 50s, their body carried decades of strain. Bones cracked easily. Muscles weakened. Pain was constant. Yet they continued to work because survival demanded it. Meals were sparse and repetitive. Bread, porridge, occasional vegetables, rarely meat. Spices were expensive. Sugar was unheard of. Food provided energy, not pleasure. Water had to be drawn daily. Milk was boiled, if there was any. Ale or weak beer was safer than water in towns. Hygiene was rudimentary. Bathing was infrequent. Clothes were worn until tattered. Hair and nails were cut only when necessary. Parasites were common. Lice, fleas, and ticks were everyday companions. Everyday life carried constant threats. Injury could be fatal. Illness could be fatal. Hunger could be fatal. Violence could be fatal. Even a simple journey carried risk. Travel between villages or towns meant exposure to robbers, wild animals, and harsh weather. Merchants and messengers rarely traveled alone. Children observed the dangers constantly. They learned to fear dogs, rivers, carts, tools, and strangers. Their world was small, but filled with threats. Every corner, every sound, every shadow was significant. Nighttime was terrifying. Without modern lighting, darkness was complete. Shadows moved unpredictably. Every noise outside suggested danger. People prayed frequently, hoping for protection. Sleep offered little relief. The fire burned low. Cold seeped in. The body was weary. The mind was alert. Evening conversations often revolved around survival, food scarcity, weather, work for the next day, news of deaths, diseases, or raids. Religion shaped every thought. Prayers were repeated mechanically. Superstitions guided behavior. Amulets, charms, and signs were common. Yet there were brief moments of joy. A child laughing, a song by the hearth, a festival or feast when the church allowed. These moments were fleeting. Soon, reality returned, and so the day ended, not with peace, but with anticipation of the next struggle. Surviving one day meant starting the next in full knowledge that work, hunger, fear, and pain would continue. This was life in the Middle Ages. No one rested easily. No one lived for pleasure alone. Life was endurance. Every hour counted. Every day was survival. People learned from the day before. They adapted. They endured. And still, they hoped, quietly, that tomorrow would be less harsh.